All right, guys, we're going to start, and as people join us, then I will just admit them into the room. So, for those who are new, welcome. Those who have done this before, welcome back. And tonight we're going to it's going to be a bit of a longer lecture and a rather historical lecture, but you will see everything will come together. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy it. And as before, if we're going to get cut off because of the limit of the one session, then give it 10 minutes. Remember, give it 10 minutes, have a break, get a cup of coffee or something, and then 10 minutes later, just log on again using the second link. Um, right. So we're going to jump straight into it. Wait, there's two more people that are going to join. Let me just let them in. Okay, so welcome to the early church and the Roman life. Lecture 1, we're going to specifically look at the theater. And what we're going to do is throughout this lecture, we're going to look at different aspects of the Roman life. And a lot of it had to do with the sport, with entertainment, with monetary, with the policies, with the way they chose the senators and all that kind of stuff. And how Paul makes a connection between that and the early church, and of course, then the connection of us in today's life, and what does that mean for us in modern life? And that's more or less what we're going to be looking. So, just again, a bit of a let me just get rid of this. All right, there we go. So, one of the most fascinating things about the writing of the Apostle Paul is how he draws metaphors from everyday life in Roman Empire to speak into the Christian walk, both in those days, the early church, and today for us. But the problem is, for many of us in the 21st century, we don't understand the Roman Empire, or we know very limited knowledge from maybe when we did history in school, or some of you who've done lectures with me or have listened to sermons of mine, then might have a better understanding. But most of us don't have such a deeper understanding. And so we miss out the deeper meaning that Paul intends to when he uses certain terms, when he uses certain language, when he uses certain words in Greek or in Latin. In fact, in these lectures, I'm hoping to help us understand Paul and his Roman world in a better way. And we will look through some of the ways in which Paul is employing these metaphors in order to help them and us to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus today. So, in the first lecture, we will launch into the theater, a powerful venue for shaping culture. And so, we're going to talk about how did the theater function, how is Paul interacting with it in his writing, and what does it mean for us today? So, that's what we're going to be looking at. And we're going to talk about something that every respectable Greco Roman city had. They had a theater. And this is an artist rendering of the Acropolis at Pergamum of the first century. And so, for those of you who studied Revelation, the Pergamum was one of the first, one of the churches that was mentioned. So, I'm going to ask you to just make sure your sound is nicely on. And I'm going to just play this little clip for you for a few minutes.
Your sound on. You said you must make sure your sound is on.
Sounds like.
Yeah. Mute.
Mike and Mary, your mic is on, so if you can just mute yourself.
Mute.
Right. So that was just an artist rendering. One of you guys got your microphone on so I can hear everything you're talking, and if you're coughing or sneezing, all of us can hear. So just mute yourself, please. That would be great. So that was an artist rendering of just one aspect of Pergamum, as I said, and you could see by looking at that little clip of an artist rendering of it, of the fact that the theater was the center, but it was often attached to a temple, and not only that, but it would be a market of some sort, and it was a big thing. It was a day out, if not even days out, or a week celebration of whatever. Central feature of every respecting Greco-Roman, that means Greek or Roman city, is a theater. So here's one that you can see at the top is of Hierapolis, which is near Colossia and Laodicea. Again, those names you would remember from some of the churches from Revelation. Then you get the one in the middle, which is in Athens. There are some that are constructed a little bit different, but the theater actually begins here in Athens. That's the middle picture one in the 6th century BC. And it was constructed, and these are the ruins of what it is in Athens. I would love one day to go and visit it. And very quickly, the theater becomes institutionalized in a connection to a springtime festival called Dionysia, which was the worship of the Greek god Dionysus. And you can see here at the bottom holding a bunch of grapes. Now, Dionysius was the god of wine. He was a god of fertility, the god of party, and you've got this theater. Now, here's why it became the theater, because initially he's a fertility deity. The god of wine is that he became the god of the theater in connection to the festival. This modern day film festival essentially was linked to the springtime festival of Dionysius, and as a result of the theater connection, is this connected to the worship, because again, often there will be a temple right next to the theater, and there would be the worship of the god, and he became the patron deity of the arts. He becomes the god of theater. In fact, this image in the middle that I said in the previous slide, in this slide, is at the theater because he was the god of the theater, and it's front and center on what was called the senior front. Now you can see here I've got just a cross section of a theater, and I'll explain to you why it's important to mention those different things later on. And you can see there that it is Palpatium, and the Sanita front and Sania that we will look at. So again, we've got the theater in Athens, where it begins in the 6th century BC, but the Romans' first encounter with the theater was actually not with the Greeks. It was actually with another group, the people group that is off to the northwest of Rome, the Etruscanians or Etruscans, and that was actually the first encounter that Romans had with regards to theater. And some people say that that people group was actually a cut off or a sect of the Greeks. But the Romans took that idea, and we find is that Rome began to engage with ancient Greek theater in the 3rd century. And what happened was that as the Romans began to expand and take over the Greek territories, they are now engaging Greek theater. And now theater is influencing how the Romans will do theater going forward. By the way, this is why you keep hearing me or historians or theologians talk about Greco-Roman. It's because the Greek and the Roman world, there is some differences, but there's a tremendous amount of commonality. And so what the Romans did, though, is it took the idea of theater and it put it on steroids. Okay, they made it even bigger. I mean, they just enhanced it, made it huge, the way the Roman Empire knows how to do. And again, on the side of the slide, you can see this is one of the astounding theater from the entire ancient world, and it's a place called Spandos. And this is one of the finest theater that you will see from the Roman world. Now, this was constructed in the 2nd century AD, but it gives you an idea of what the Romans were doing with theater. And if we kind of go into the theater now, I will kind of walk you through what are the kinds of the parts of the theater, and that becomes important for us to understand Paul later on, and we will make that connection at the end of the lecture. So look at the theater. Look at this cross section, and you go, well, that looks kind of big. How big is it? Well, it's about 20,000 people that can fit into this theater. Well, how do we know? Because they still hold film festivals here, and they pack 20,000 people for the film festival at this theater at Aspendos. Now, in the theater structure, is this you have what is called the Scania fronts, okay, and you can see there in a picture below. That is the stage, the backdrop, and then you have what is called the pulpitium, and it's missing here, or not completely in its fullness, although there is an arrow going right to the bottom, and that is the stage. So you have the backdrop. Okay, and then you have the stage, what we know, where everything is being performed from there. But it's not only the pulpitium that you have there, also the orchestra. Now, feels confusing to us because when we hear orchestra, we go, oh, well, that's the place where the musical instruments are, where the musicians are. And in modern theaters, they're sort of at the bottom, they're sort of sunk in at the edge of the stage. Let me just let one person in. And that's not what the orchestra was originally used for. It was additional space for singing and dancing and for actors who were not the main actors to come out from the side tunnels and come and do all kinds of fun, extravagant things as part of the theatrical production. And then you have what are called, well, this part is called the prohoderia, which is the very front part. Most important people sat in the front. We talk about it when there's concert, the golden circle, okay, where you pay quite a lot of money, but you're right in front. You could even touch or throw nice things at the person who's singing. They did not have box seating in those days. So you will get the front seat. And again, where you sit in the theater is an indication of where you are on the social structure. And all of this, guys, is important to understand because Paul is going to talk about these things in scriptures that are well known to us. And you can see here what I'm talking about. There's a skin here, there's an orchestra, and there's those that golden seats, the where the important people are. And you can see also just some of the ruins on the other side of those important seats of the people who are watching. The most important people are in the front. The least important are in the very back. And so the proderia was the first row or the lower section in connection to what we call the caviars, or you get what you call the Ima caviar and the Suma caviar. And don't worry about knowing all these names, but you can see, you will see just now how it all relates. And if there is another caviar, which are times there were 3 sections rather than 2 sections, it was called a media caviar. And so that one is in the middle. What you need to understand is, as you look at this diagram, is again, where you were sitting was very important. In a way, it still is the same now because those who get the front seat, not only do they get to see, the actor or the singer or the celebrity right up in the front, but they also get few items and things like that, maybe for free or some sponsorship and things like that. So and we sort of look at them and say, oh well, they're lucky they got the same thing now that has replaced this is the boxes that we have. Companies, you have boxes, and you can go and see a match or something like that. So again, where you sit is very important. Now, right here are these entryways in and out of the theater. They're called vomitaria. Okay, very nice word, vomitaria, because when the theater production is done, the theater literally vomits you out of the theater. And so that's where they got the name vomitaria. And it's really corridors that under the seats that leads onto the orchestra. Right. So that's a little bit of naming, dropping names of weird language and so on. Now, a couple just really quick things that help you to understand what the Romans were doing, because the Roman made it their mind some improvements to what the Greeks have done. Namely, the Romans wanted to make things bigger. That's what Rome is all about. More extravagant, more action to what was going on. So one of the things that they did is that they raised the scena fronts, okay, the backdrop. They raised it up. They made it even wider. So for the Greeks, it was maybe about half that height, but the Romans go, no, we need a bigger stage back. We need a bigger drop than that. We need to do some more things. And one of the dead giveaway that you are in a theater that is a Roman theater versus a Greek theater is because that Skinner Franz connected with the Summa Cavia. Remember, this Summa Cavias are the seats that different levels of the seats. In other words, that connects to it, almost creating like a box that we know of. Or if you think of you go to a theater, especially an old theater, and you look to the left or you look to the right against the stage. If you think of the royal variety show, the Queen, the royalties, they sit right there in the front. So it's that kind of effect that the Romans introduced into the theater. Now, not every theater is in good enough condition for you to see, for you to see what I'm just talking about. But they made the stage back bigger, and they said that the orchestra area is kind of cool, but we rather have more action on the stage. So what have they done? They extended the stage out, made the orchestra area even smaller, so that they could do more on the stage, because when it comes to the biggest difference between the Greek and the Roman theater, it was all about action, extravagance, and spectacular. They wanted to be loud, they wanted to be seen, they wanted to be absolutely spectacular. Now, when it comes to theatre in Paul's days, there were four types of drama. The first is tragedy, the second is comedy. Now, this is tragedy and comedy as we think of in connection to classical Greece, in that tragedy was pulled from the 5th century onward, and these were your classical Greek story. Okay? It was seen as classical even in Paul's day, and it is very much like attending some kind of a Shakespeare play. It was about being seen there. It was the fact that you were going to do that show. It was very sophisticated. It was probably very, very stuffy, very like hoity-toity. This is what we know as ancient Greek tragedy. Comedy was also a classical form in Paul's day, but comedy is you have a really witty slave that outwits his master, or you've got the guy who's so madly in love with the girl, he'd do anything and go to whatever length necessary to get her, and there is comedy built throughout. These were both seen as classical forms in a time of Paul. Still popular, but the popularity was waning significantly because of these two that were on the rise. You have the pantomime and the mime. Okay, so we've got tragedy, comedy, pantomime, and mime. And so I want to camp on these two briefly in order to see the connection that Paul makes and us now understanding a little bit more. We've seen the artistic rendering clip, and we've seen everything else as well. I've just been notified that we're going to be kicked out in about 10 minutes. So if we do get kicked out, most likely we will. Remember, 10 minutes, give it 10 minutes, and then log on to the second session. Okay, let's carry on until that happens. And so, as I said, I want to just camp here a little bit and talk briefly about these two ideas in Paul's day. What were they filling the theatres for? What, in other words, why they were going? It was pantomime and mime that were on the rise during Paul's time. Not so much a comedy and a tragedy. Pantomime is this dramatic performance set to music. Think ballet. Think very elegant, very choreographed. It is stunning. It is well performed, well organized. It's performed by a single actor. That's what pantomime means. It all means all mime. They are playing all parts, one actor playing all parts. It's one performer or one singer, actor, and you have these movements in this pantomime that were very highly suggestive. Think Dirty Dancing. And when you have these performances that are set to music, there are no words per se. There's literally the actor will not really say much, no sentences. The pantomime is not speaking and it's just set to music. Then you have to draw on things that people know. So these are known plots from mythology that are performed without words. And so the moment that it begins, the style of music and then the costume and the mask and the stage designs, and everyone goes, oh, I know what they're going to be talking about. I've sort of seen that. I know where they're going to draw this from. It got the audience in immediately, so they didn't have to try to figure out on the contextual setting. They were already in the storyline. And you have these elaborate stages, these amazing costumes and masks, and this outstanding special effects of that day. And people loved attending the pantomime, even though they were very highly suggestive. Now, mine took it much further. When it came to these mime production, you had an artist played one character, and they did not wear any mask. And the reason that is because it primarily included a dialogue. So now he's talking here. Now, yes, you have dance and music and all of that, but it was very verbally based and it was incredibly popular among the low brow audience due to the groin humor of what they call. Okay. And some of you like I say, okay, well, okay, I get it. Others are saying, what do you mean by that? It's because it included sexually explicit speeches and at times even sexual acts on stage. And it was about mimicking people in caricature that were way over the top. Think Saturday Night Live if you ever watched it, because here's the point that you want everyone in the audience to go, oh no, they didn't do that. They didn't just say that. Are you kidding me? They actually said that out loud. It was always to get rise from the audience, and quite often it was verbal, it was erotic, it was suggestive, and people packed the theater in Paul's day for the mime production. Okay, important to know all of this background for the rest of our lectures and for the rest of this lecture. Now, of note, no respectable woman would ever be seen at a pantomime and definitely not in a mime performance. You would see them at the tragedy and a comedy. You would never see them in either of these two because of the suggestive sexual movement that were in the pantomime and the actual speech and acts in the mime production. And again, every single self-respecting Greco-Roman city had a theater and would either have the mime or the pantomime or the tragedy or the comedy. Okay, now Paul knows his culture. He knows this context. He's seen it. He had seen it being constructed. He has seen it happen in front of him. My guess, he might have even gone to a comedy, a tragedy. He might have walked out in the middle of a pantomime. He probably would never even have gone to a mime. And he's drawing from these things that they understood in order to make a point. Because if he hasn't been there, almost guarantees some of the audience that he's going to talk to, whether they are from Jewish background or whether they are from a Roman background or a Greek background, or whether they are Jews or Gentiles, or master or someone lower in the society hierarchy, they would have no doubt would have gone to a pantomime and a mime production. And what Paul is going to talk to about in his letters, in his writing, he's speaking to an audience that will understand the language that he uses. And that's why I love when I preach, I love when I teach to look at these words, because Paul is very careful when he uses his words. He's very educated. Remember, he can speak the language, he knows the culture, he is a citizen of Rome, and so he chooses his words very carefully. So let's show you a few connections. And again, if we get cut off, please, guys, especially for the new ones, just wait 10 minutes and log on to the second section. But let's move on until we get cut off. And I want to show you a few connections as it relates to theater. One of the scriptures, Paul says, therefore be imitators of God. Now, it is a Greek word, mimentai, and it means to mimic or imitate. But it also where we get the word mime from, okay? Mime and the pantomime, okay? So Paul says, be imitators of God, not of those actors that you see are trying to caricature or trying to make fun of different things, but be imitators of God. In other words, you need to mimic God. You need to be able to embody God. And he goes on, as beloved of children. and walk in love, just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. But sexual immorality, why is he saying sexual immorality? Because those kind of things would have been in the pantomime and definitely in the mind, or impurity or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is proper among the saints. And this is from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 to 3 and 45. Now, where is this kind of language happening? Okay. It's happening in the brothel. It's happening in the pubs. And it's happening in the theater. Most likely, as we said, not in the pantomime because there's no words in there, but most likely in the mime, that mementi that Paul is using. And where it gets even more clarified is what comes next. Another one. And there must be no filthiness or foolish talk or vulgar joking. Some of you are saying, of course, maybe coarse joking. Now, this phrase vulgar joking is in the Greek is just one of these words, which is eutrapelia. It's called a hapax legmenon, which means it's only used once in the New Testament. So it's very important because Paul uses that particular phrase because he wanted to make a point even further. And it literally means a turn of phrase. That's what it literally means. But it gets translated as vulgar joking. So he's saying, and there must be no filthiness or foolish talk or turn of phrase. It's because this eutrapelia, this idea of a turn of phrase, is indicative of what happens in the mime production. When there was a shock phrase that was used. All right, guys, we're going to carry on then. We stopped at this where it gets. Sorry, let me just let two more people in. Where we were talking about, as I start talking, someone else joins. Okay. So as we were talking about this turn of phrase, it literally means translated to vulgar joking that Paul uses in that scripture. And that is exactly what the performance used to do in the mime, is that it took something and then it turned it and made it even more sexual. Okay. And that's why it says vulgar joking when it literally means a turn of phrase, because it's referring to those shock statements that screamed forth in the pantomime production and certainly in the mime production. And Paul says, this is not fitting, but rather give thanks, giving of thanks. For this you know with certainty that no sexual, immoral, or impure or greedy person, which amounts to an adulterer, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Remember, Paul in his writing is mainly talking to the churches that will be planted, and his main focus in all of his writing is to how do we become in Christ. So for those in at the hill, at the moment we're doing that fruit of the Spirit. Why is Paul talking about the fruit of the Spirit? Well, if you want to be more like Christ, we need to display those particular fruits of the Spirit. And here Paul is saying, well, if you want to be a person with vulgar joking or turning of phrase, if you want to be involved in sexual immorality, impurity, greed, if you want to be that kind of a person that is involved in gossip and slander and all that kind of stuff, then you're not going to have an inheritance in the kingdom of God. Then you cannot be a part of Christ. Then Christ cannot be in you. And that's why Paul is using those particular words, that particular language of the theater. And this is very, very careful what comes out. He says, what you need to be very, very careful of what comes out of your mouth. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak with noisy gong, the tongue of mankind and of angel, but do not love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, when you read it, you think, okay, well, I sort of understand what Paul is saying. Well, noisy gong is two words here in English, and it's also two words in the Greek. The first one is the word kalkos, which is a brass gong. And then you got the word echon, which is noise. Okay, so it's a good translation. Brass gong, that's a noisy, seems to be referring to the sounding jar that Vivius writes about. He was a writer of that time. And what these things were is that they were placed on the stage, at the back of the stage, against the senior fronds, the backdrop. And when you wanted to have the voice of God to echo through the theater, you had these big vases or big jars that somebody would yell into, and it would produce this kind of voice. Thus says the Lord, echo, and it boomed forth in the theater. So they did this if you are to hear the voice of God or some kind of a mythical creature. And so Paul says in that scripture, if I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not love, I have become like a noisy gong, like these jars that are at the back of the senior fronds, this clanging cymbals. In other words, he says, you may be content that you are speaking the voice of God, but if love is not emanating forth from you, you may think that you are sounding forth the voice of God, but it's only a theatrical stunt. It's only a special effect. It's only this noise that sounds like a mythical deity, sounds like God, but it's not the real thing because there is no love. In other words, love is an indication of what's behind the words. And Paul is putting this distinction together. And it's fascinating how Paul uses his word. Paul warns them in 1 Corinthians 13 about this, and then in 1 Thessalonians 1 and 8, he seems to use it in a really positive way when he talks about Thessalonians' witnesses. And he says, for the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but in every place the news of your faith towards God has gone out, so that we have no need to say anything. Almost like the pantomime, that you don't even have to say a word. People will look at you and will know that you are a follower of Christ. There won't be need for special effects because you are displaying your faith towards God. Fascinating, isn't it? Well, let me read this one from Romans chapter 1. And we all know, or many of us know, Romans chapter 1 is really intense. And notice what Paul does in the midst of this intense conversation with the Romans, okay? He writes to the Romans. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to the depraved mind, to those things that are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossipers, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, unmerciful. Huge words, big words, words that would have been in the pantomime, words that would have been in the mime. And then he says, and although they know the audience of God, can you see again? He's talking about, the ordinance of God. He's talking about who God is, those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So if we tolerate those kind of things, okay, again, you touched a little bit about people at the Hill, the guy that came and spoke a few Sundays ago. Some of us were not feeling comfortable, but that is the reality that is out there. And in a way, if I had to sum what he said, he's saying if we approve of that, if we are okay with that coming into our churches, coming into our universities, coming into our schools environment, if we're okay with that, we approve with those practices, then are we not in a way doing or are partaking in that part, the mime or the pantomime? Something to think about. Two words for approve here is the Greek word synedika, and it means to join in approval, to join the applause. And what was stated of what an audience would do in a theatrical performance to thank the actors, they would applaud. Okay. So at the end of the mime, which was highly explicit, highly sexual, probably all those words that he mentioned in the scripture I just read, and at the end of it, the audience would applaud. So he's saying by applauding, by applause that you're giving to the audience, I mean the audience are giving to the actors. Paul, in his understanding, it's like you're actually acknowledging you partaking in that. And Paul says here, there are those who do not only do all these things, they're actually joining in the applause of other disobedience as well. And that brings me to just my final thought here. What was the purpose of the theater? What was the purpose of the theater in the first place? It wasn't just about entertainment. It was actually about education. It was about educating you on a world view, because they knew that as people came in and they were entertained, that they would let down their guards. And so it was in the theater where you would introduce things to help culture know where they are supposed to go. It will shape the culture. The theater, which included the mime and the pantomime and the comedy and the tragedy. Those were stories, those were acted out, but they actually were introducing stuff into the culture of the day. And Paul is warning the Christians, the believers of the early church, and us to be careful of that. And so the idea was that at any point in time you wanted to change the course of culture, you wanted to shift things and to have them go a certain direction, you would introduce those cultural shaping ideas first and foremost where? In the theater, into the theater. Because the goal of the theater was to entertain you in a new education. And things, if you think about it, things have not changed over the last 2,000 years. Because if you want to change the culture today, if you want to push the envelope, if you want to take something that is taboo in society and make it normal, that change of phrase, a turn of phrase, create an award-winning show on Netflix or a reel on TikTok or Instagram, and watch how fast culture will adopt it. At first, they will be shocked by it, but over time, it becomes normalized. Over time, they applaud to it, and over time, they become a part of that mindset, a part of the cultural change, part of the paradigm shift. And it's happening. And one of the ways in which it is happening in our world and has been true for thousands of years is not always, but typically it's through comedy, isn't it? Because if I can get you to laugh, I can get you to consider. If I can get you to consider, I may be able to get you to adopt that thing. If you think of a tragedy that happens, what's the first thing that we see on Facebook and WhatsApp and stuff like that? It's jokes. Okay. I mean, take for example, I don't know if you've heard the speech between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and he was mentioning something about in Springfield that the immigrants are eating dogs and cats. And today, I mean, any social platform is filled with memes. And what are memes? Memes comes from the same word as mimes, okay? Of these cats and dogs that are scared because they're going to be eaten. There's songs, there's rap already, music that has been happening. That's how quickly it happens. And we laugh at it, but slowly we begin to adopt it. Slowly we applaud to it, and applaud in the Greek and in Paul's mindset and understanding is we actually take a part of it. And when it comes to entertainment, we have to be very, very careful on what is shaping our minds, what is shaping us, because if we are not, we might just join in the applause of our culture and not the crust, our crust, and what Christ wants us to be. And so, guys, next week we're going to continue. And next week, we lecture 2, the Romans were obsessed with the games and the sport to the extent that the athletes were treated like celebrities and passionate fans sometimes rioted. Nothing changed. And Herod the Great was even voted as president of the Olympic Games for life. Among the most popular games were the foot races and chariot races, which captivated the public's imagination. And the Apostle Paul frequently drew on this imagery, using the idea of running a race to describe the Christian life, urging believers to run well, strain forward, and keep their eyes fixed on the ultimate goal. He did the same with the chariot race as well. And by understanding these cultural references that we're going to look at lecture 2, we gain clarity on what was Paul admonishing believers to do to be faithful to Jesus in our lives. So, guys, there you have it. Lecture 1. Any questions, any observations?
Very interesting. Thank you, Lachai. Gee whiz.
All right. Anyone else?
You often read these things, and you just don't get the gist of it. And this has added a new layer, a new meaning. So go back and read it again.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mike. Anyone else?
Thank you very much, Lachai. As always, very interesting.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right, guys, then we conclude our lecture number 1. Tomorrow sometime I will send you the recording, and I will email you as well the notes. For those who couldn't log on, I hope we log on. We'll see you next week, but enjoy the recording of the lecture. And as Mike said, maybe go through it again, so you have a better understanding. I know there were a lot of words, a lot of imageries of the theater, but I needed you to have that kind of a imagery so you can understand the words that Paul used. So God bless and have a good evening.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Good night. Good night, everybody.
Night. Night.
Good night.
Night.